Man advances faster every day in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. From the beginning of the universe or the birth of a star, to the origin of life and genetic inheritance, the enigmas of existence have progressively been figured out. However, the human brain, which has allowed man to achieve this knowledge, is still a mystery. In their practicing hall, a musical quartet is rehearsing several masterpieces. The essence of human intelligence is summarized in music, the perfect combination of reason and emotion. Each member of the group, overflowing with a whirlwind of sensations, uses his memory to remember the piece, glancing at the musical score every once in a while and concentrating to create a virtuoso performance in unison with his companions. The technique is already subconscious, while their attention is aimed at creating the most moving performance. This is the objective, to provoke an emotion that, in this case, the listeners can intimately share, and which arouses sensations of pleasure, and sometimes rejection, in the mind. In order for this to happen, music has needed memory, intelligence, and will. Where are they, and why are they produced? These abilities come from the brain, the corporal organ where all our thoughts and actions are developed. This is also the place where the mind is found, as well as the essence of a person, what she thinks, what she feels, and what she imagines. It is the hotbed of sensations and feelings, of images and ideas of each individual human being. Due to its complexity, the brain is one of the territories under scientific investigation with the most mysteries. The basis of its biology is known, as well as some models of its functionality. But yet it's not understood why some things are remembered, while others are not. Why such a strange mechanism like the human mind worries about itself, about the origin of life, and about the meaning of death.
We have a lot of data, but what we lack is a theory. What we lack is a way of putting together and integrating the different levels of understanding that we have. So I can give you a beautiful molecular description of the processes that go on when an animal learns, or I think when a human learns as well. But then I go out of the laboratory in the evening and I sit, as I will this evening, having seen the pictures in the Prado today, and I will think about the Hieronymus Bosch or the Velázquez, and I will picture them in my mind. And I do not know how I make that memory. And I do not know ever whether the sort of scientific techniques we use in the laboratory can integrate the objectivity of the laboratory with the subjectivity of our unique personal experience of memory.
The brain became an object of systematic study during the 19th century, when physiologists and psychologists became immersed in a passionate debate about the possibility that the mind and brain was the same thing. Today, there is no doubt that the physical support of the mind is the brain. The scientific community, however, is divided among those who defend that the mind and the brain are identical, and those who believe that the mind is much more than the brain.
They do certainly not think, the neurobiologists, that brain and mind is the same thing, is identical. They do, however, believe, and this quite firmly, that all the mental phenomena, the psychological phenomena, including consciousness, are an emergent property of the neuronal functions of the brain. So they are functions of the brain, but they are, of course, not identical with the brain. The same relation exists between nervous systems and behavior. The behavior obviously comes out of neuronal interactions, but it is not identical. It needs to be described in a different description system as the molecular processes or the material processes in the brain. So there is a correlation, and there's, as we think, also a causal relation between brain processes and mental phenomena, but there is no identity.
I think that most people would agree, people who are in this field, that what we call mind is simply the activity of the billions of nerve cells in the brain. The patterns of activity are more or less synonymous with what we call mind. Because for every aspect of the mind, for every percept, every thought, there's always an equivalent pattern of neural activity. This is the axiomatic foundation of all our research.
The human brain is the result of millions of years of biological evolution, starting with a basic structure, typical of reptiles. On top of this basic brain, more evolved species began to superimpose new layers of tissue with a greater volume until reaching the brain configuration of the Homo sapiens. Therefore, the most primitive part of the brain is the brainstem or reptilian brain, which is found connected to the upper part of the spinal cord. It serves to regulate basic vital functions like breathing and metabolism, as well as reactions and automatic movements. This brain does not think or learn. It only mechanically responds to determined signals. For example, an animal's attack mechanisms are activated when it smells prey. With the appearance of the first mammals, the cerebral cortex and limbic system were developed, a new cellular territory that surrounded the brainstem. Two powerful tools for survival appeared with it: learning and memory. Thus, compared to other species, mammals were able to remember a past experience in order to repeat it, or not, in the present. For example, if a specific food was harmful the first time it was consumed, the animal knew what it had to do from that moment on. With the limbic system, emotions multiplied, since this is the primary headquarters for fear and pleasure. When human beings are trapped by desire or anger, when love drives them crazy or fear paralyzes them, in reality, they are under the influence of this part of the brain. In recent phases of evolution, the superior mammals added a new stratum of brain cells which formed the neocortex, the region for higher cognitive abilities that allow for planning, understanding, and developing willpower. The place for thinking is found in the neocortex. If with the limbic structure, love is pleasure and sexual desire, Its connection to the neocortex also causes the feelings or the desire for commitment in order to establish family and emotional bonds. The human brain and that of the chimpanzee are barely distinguishable by just looking at them. Both have a brainstem, a limbic system, and a brain cortex. There's nothing in physiology that justifies such great differences in their abilities and behavior.
In cellular and molecular terms, the brains of a human and the brain of a chimpanzee are very identical, almost identical. No neuroanatomist, given a microscope picture of a nerve cell from a chimpanzee or from a chick, which are the young animals that I work with, or a human, could tell you which was which. The differences lie in the range and the wealth, the richness of the connections between the cells.
It is not even clear what are the differences. It's clearly, again, our cortex is much more developed than the cortex of the apes, the neocortex. But very likely the difference is essentially a quantitative difference. It's not that we have something different from the apes. It's that we have more of the same. Okay, we have more neurons, we have more of neocortex, so we can do more things, more complex things than the ape can. But the basic tools, the basic pieces, they are the same.
The brain cortex in humans makes up about 76% of the brain, while in chimpanzees it only makes up 72%. This small difference of barely 4% in the development of the neocortex seems to be the key for the distance between human beings and other primates. The more neocortex there is, the higher number of cells there are and connections among them. As a result, there is a greater ability for observation, reflection, and learning. Apes can create images in their mind that reproduce reality. But human beings can also elaborate symbols and concepts, representations of this reality that are more or less abstract, which allows them to make observations with a broader point of view. While an orangutan feels anger, it is overwhelmed by the emotion. This can also happen to human beings, but they are the only ones that can reflect on the concept of anger, or even modify their behavior after this reflection. The distance between this angry ape and the human who controls his anger is greater when the human can also transmit and teach its peers the advantages and inconveniences of anger. Greater communication, higher learning, and better permeability in the environment have allowed humans to develop cultures. An intellectual knowledge that completes and enriches the biological knowledge and the personal instinct of the species. And just like genes, culture can be transmitted from parents to children. And thanks to this, children can broaden the limited knowledge of past generations. This does not happen in any other animal community.
The other extraordinary thing about humans in particular, unlike any other animal, is because we have not only our own individual memories in our heads, but because we have memories which are created socially by writing, by television, by radio, by the media, by the historical record, our memories, unlike any other species, are also social and historical. They don't begin and end with our own deaths.
Does the brain change as more knowledge is acquired? Children go to school. Would they have the same brain if they didn't go? The degree of influence that the environment and culture have on the human brain is another area for scientific debate. Controversy arises between those who defend that we are a result of genetic inheritance and those who believe that the brain is molded, especially with real experiences and the information received from the surrounding world.
The idea that the brain is a blank page is not true. We have a series of elements recorded in the brain, meaning that we learn to walk without needing to be taught, and that we learn to talk without needing to be explicitly taught. In that, when we receive certain information, we are able to talk. The fact is that the brain has a series of patterns of activity, behavioral patterns that are pre-recorded, to put it popularly, which are genetically inherited and which are the result of evolution and the result of selection. I think we have to accept that. Without a doubt, it is a brain that has a determined type of patterns and a great complexity within these patterns, recorded in a genetic way, but which may or may not be expressed according to the influences from the outside world.
Registrados de manera genética se pueden expresar o no en función de las influencias del mundo exterior.
It's a little bit like a computer. There's the hardware and there is the software. The hardware is how the brain is constructed, how the material is there. And this is genetically determined because your brain is made like mine. And all humans within one species, we all have the same brain. So it means there is a genetic determinism. And all birds have the same brain, and snakes have the same brains, and so on and so forth. But the software, that is what you are filling your brain with, what gives rise to emotions, to memory, to thinking, to the perception of things from the outside, that of course is not genetically determined. This is the result of your environment. Now what is very interesting is that there are theories in neurobiology which are linking these two things and which are proposing that the environment is taking part in building the brain. That is, that in fact the software would take part, would participate to make the hardware of the computer.
Santiago Ramón y Cajal, winner of the Nobel Prize in 1906, demonstrated that the nervous system and the brain were made up of cells, just like the rest of living tissues. These cells were called neurons, and the connections between them the synapses. Together, they are the brain's foundation for functionality. Everything that takes place inside the brain can be described as a large network of electric impulses and chemical reactions between the neurons. There are thousands of millions of neurons, and they are organized in microscopic circuits that at the same time are organized in successive systems, which are becoming larger and more complex every day. Neurons have specialized extensions called axons, which send out information, and dendrites, which receive data from other brain cells. When a neuron transmits electric impulses to another neuron, the synapsis releases neurotransmitters, chemical substances that help transmit the message to the receiver area of another neuron. Neurotransmitters freed by a neuron are capable of affecting the functionality of other nervous cells, activating them or inhibiting them. They can also navigate through the blood to a specific organ in order to act upon it. Furthermore, they can also stimulate hormonal actions. They are therefore transmitters of chemical or electrical information that fire the brain's responses. A neurotransmitter is, for example, serotonin, a substance whose shortage is related to aggression and social behavior. When lower amounts of serotonin are generated in the neurons, it's possible that the individual's behavior will be more violent. Brain circuits are hyperactive. Neurons process sensorial information continuously, which, without interruptions, reach the brain from the outside as well as from the body itself. The outside world communicates with the brain thanks to sight, sound, touch, smell, and taste, the senses or sensorial mechanisms of the body. Not all of them, however, are equally important. Whales, sperm whales, and dolphins are considered animals of great intelligence. They learn fast and have a very elaborate language for communication. But the most striking aspect of the functionality of their brain is that they use their ears as their main source of information. Cetaceans continually emit sounds that bounce off everything in their path. The sound of these impacts is processed in the brain, which is how they determine with precision the size and distance of objects. They become oriented and they navigate and capture prey through this biological sonar, especially when they are swimming in dark or cloudy waters. We humans, on the other hand, perceive reality mostly through vision. What we see with our eyes is more convincing than what we smell through our nose or touch with our hands. If there is a conflict between the information sent by our other sensorial systems and what we see with our eyes, the brain will trust what our eyes see. For this man, however, perfect vision does not guarantee that he will capture the most elemental reality without any problems. This is the clinically described case of a musician incapable of interpreting the data transmitted by his eyes. His doctor showed him a rose, and he described it as a 15-centimeter long object, a red circular form with a green line added on. When he smelled it, however, the sensations became pure recognition. Oh, it's a rose. This case, described by the famous neurobiologist Oliver Sacks, shows how damage to the brain prevents visual information from being correctly processed, something that does not happen when the data comes from other senses. In reality, we do not use our eyes to see, but rather our brain. The organ for seeing is a mere camera that collects luminous information made up of thousands of colors and contrasts that the brain transforms into objects, people, and sensations. The brain interprets the information and directs the attention to certain aspects of the image, like a table, a knife, and a child. Then, the brain describes what it has seen, it interprets it, and compares it with the database in its memory, and finally provokes a reaction. Careful, the child might take the knife and hurt himself. Starting in the 19th century, the observation and study of syndromes and strange diseases due to brain damage were a major incentive in the development of brain sciences. It was a time when the location of the mind was highly debated, and those who defended that the mind was found in the brain were supported by solid evidence related to syndromes and rare ailments. For the first time, it was possible to establish some correlations between specific parts of the brain and certain mental functions. The French doctor Paul Broca was one of the pioneers in the discovery of locating some functions of the brain. After several autopsies performed on patients who had suffered deterioration in speech, he was able to determine a relationship between oral expression and the third convolution of the frontal left lobe. Later investigation has confirmed that the ability of verbal expression is located in this area. The work by Broca and his contemporaries marked a path of research for neurosciences, which are still used even today. They consist in dividing the brain into parts in order to define which mental functions are related to each section.
Well, two techniques commonly used are correlating the location of the lesion with changes in behavior. You know, when a small part of the brain is damaged, you get not an across-the-board reduction in all your abilities, but often a highly selective loss. And that gives you confidence in asserting that that part of the brain is involved in that function. Another technique is to do functional brain imaging, where different parts of the brain light up when you engage in different tasks, and you can actually image these parts of the brain. And by combining these two techniques, we can now learn a great deal about localization of brain function. And I think a better word is specialization rather than localization, that some part of the brain is specialized for mediating a particular function. There are many striking examples. One is the fusiform gyrus in the temporal lobe.
The cortex is formed by two symmetrical halves separated by a deep longitudinal groove. Their functions are different. The left hemisphere generates logical, verbal, and analytical thought, while the right hemisphere is the more subjective side, controlling emotions and creativity. If the left side is more mathematical and rational, the right side is more poetical and imaginative. Each of the hemispheres is divided into 4 lobes. The frontal lobe is related to cognition and intelligence. The parietal lobe is for sensory input. The occipital lobe processes visual information. And the temporal lobe is the auditory receptive area. Research into the different mental functions has drawn up many maps of the brain. Perhaps one of the most complete maps is the Penfield motor homunculus, developed about 50 years ago by the neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield. After carrying out brain surgery with local anesthesia, this doctor was able to observe how the stimulation of specific zones of the exterior cortex was associated with the external sensitivity of different parts of the body. This image, in human form, reproduces the correlation that he established between the different parts of the brain and of the body in accordance with the sense of touch. The hands and mouth are highlighted due to their size. For the brain, they are the best receptors of information obtained through physical contact. Locating these functions, however, has its limits. Many mental activities do not present a clear location, and mental activity is often subdivided and distributed to different parts of the brain. In the case of mathematical calculations or recognizing a face, many zones of the brain are used, not just one, in order to activate these actions.
We learn more and more that the brain executes many functions in parallel, functions that are related to each other but occur in different places in the brain and are bound together in a dynamic way rather than being bound together in a hierarchical structure. There are 2 ways to bind items together that are distributed to begin with. You have signals coming through the ear, signals coming through the eye, signals coming through the senses. and they need to be made concordant at some place. And the classical notion is that this is done through convergence in a pyramidal shaped processing architecture, and that you have on the tip of this processing pyramid the coherent representation. Now, it appears as if the brain were not organized that way. It's organized in a more distributed way. Things do not eventually come together. They stay parallel, they stay distributed.
In the right prefrontal cortex, neuroscientists have located a unique ability of human consciousness. This is empathy, a human being's capacity for experiencing the feelings and thoughts of another. He not only realizes who he is and how he feels, but also forgets about himself for a second in order to experience how the other person feels and understand her motives, her state of mind, and her feelings. Due to the development of these empathic capacities, man has been able to achieve higher levels of social and collective consciousness as he adds broader and more profound cultural values to them. Thus, only when one human finally understands what another human feels and needs is it possible to create cultural agreements based on concepts like respect, freedom, and brotherhood. Sight is an example of a complex subdivision of certain mental activities. The information coming from the eyes does not have one processing center, but 30. Each one of them is specialized in a sub-function like color, depth, size, and movement. That is why it's not surprising that there are pathologies in which patients who do not have damaged sight organs have lost functions like the ability to see color, to perceive movement, to see sharp images, or to understand the content being seen. These images have been obtained by means of a camera through the emission of positrons. This is a nuclear medical technique used in neurological exploration, which makes it possible to obtain functional images of the brain. Thanks to these technological developments, we can now see what happens in the brain during certain activities, like recalling events from infancy, memorizing a number, doing a simple mental calculation, imagining a familiar scene, remembering a face, or experiencing sensations while looking at a photograph.
Until today, we could only examine these activities using psychological techniques. Techniques used for observation outside of the subject. We would ask them to answer a question more or less quickly, and we would ask them to point to some objects, etc. But we obtained only indirect results. With the new methods, we asked them to carry out a task, like searching for words, making a calculation, making up sentences, or looking at objects, the normal tests used in this field. And we record their brain activity while they carry out these tasks, without interfering with them. Therefore, we can study different phenomena, like memory, perception, and reasoning.
Donc on peut de cette manière étudier des phénomènes comme la mémoire, comme la perception, comme le raisonnement.
Technological advances are approaching the dream of every neuroscientist, discovering the mystery behind superior cerebral or cognitive functions that allow for thinking, memorizing, reasoning, and planning actions. Nevertheless, present-day machines are still far from making this discovery. One reason, among many others, is because the speed at which the brain works is still unachievable for machines. The chemical and electrical processes of the brain develop like sparks that are produced in a thousandth of a second. In any other way, it would be impossible to carry out a process in such a short period of time, like capturing a signal, processing it, associating it with some fact in the memory, adding some element of the imagination to it, and finally generating a deduction or a mental conclusion.
We have made a lot of progress with this technique, and we will continue to make more progress. But we lack certain advances that would avoid the risk of blocking the investigation. More specifically, we need to be able to use these techniques directly. The metabolic techniques like magnetic resonance images or the use of a camera with the emission of positrons are techniques that need, in some way, evaluation periods that are not very long, but in any case, they are much longer than cognitive periods.
Produire une phrase ou pour produire un raisonnement, le cerveau va très vite. Il a besoin seulement
and to produce a sentence or a thought, the brain acts very fast. It needs only a few seconds, and the techniques that are used at this time to create a brain map are techniques that require higher acquisition periods. They take about a minute.
De plusieurs dizaines de secondes, presque de l'ordre de la minute.
Fish placed in front of a mirror are not able to recognize themselves and interpret their own image as if it were an enemy attacking them. Like most species, they do not realize that they are fish. They are not conscious of what they are. Mammals, on the other hand, manifest a primary consciousness that allows them to perceive sensations as their own. They can sense the rain falling, the sound it makes, the wetness of their skin, and the smell of wet ground. Primates like the chimpanzee or the orangutan go a little farther and present basic forms of self-recognition through which they can identify themselves as the image they see in the mirror. Their emotions are also more complex than just mere sensations. An ape feels sorrow over death or the loss of a mother, and they can suffer traumas in the development of their intellectual abilities due to being left an orphan or due to seeing a family member hunted and killed. But man is the only species with an advanced consciousness with which he can perceive himself, realize who he is, understand what he is doing and what he feels. This means that only man can observe himself and theorize about his own mind. Consciousness is such an extraordinary phenomenon that it has led scientists to ask if there is a place in the brain where it could be located.
The contents of consciousness are the most distributed ones of all, because they are polysensory, they are holistic. It's always everything that is lifted by attention into consciousness that is available at the same time. So I think this is the most distributed of all states. And I think neuropsychology confirms this. There is not a place in the brain that you can destroy to get rid of consciousness unless you destroy the power supply. You destroy systems that the brain needs to work, and then it goes into coma, or it goes to sleep, and if it doesn't dream, then there is no consciousness. So I don't think that one should look for a place. One should rather look for the code that binds these distributed activities into a coherent whole as the important variable if one talks about a key to consciousness.
The symptoms of people with an amputated extremity show how the brain is surprisingly conscious of the body. These people complain of pain in this non-existent extremity, which is also known as a phantom limb. Each part of the body is linked to a specific region of the brain, which processes information transmitted through the corresponding nervous branches. When a limb is amputated, the part of the brain associated with this limb stops receiving nervous information, which provokes a curious readjustment. The cerebral region that is located next to it absorbs the region of the amputated limb. If this correspondence existed, for example, in the cheeks, every time a person were to smile, the neurons of the amputated limb would be stimulated, causing the patient to think that the limb really existed. The patient, however, has the sensation that this limb is simply paralyzed and hurts when he tries to move it. The treatment to overcome these sensations is convincing the brain and the associated neurons that this non-existent extremity is not paralyzed but gone.
So I was wondering if there is some way you can get them to move their phantom. Maybe that would relieve the pains, at least in some cases. So we hit on the technique of putting a mirror in front of the patient, like that, sort of like that, on the table, and put the phantom on the left side of the mirror, and the real hand mimicking the position of the phantom, exactly. And then if the person looks into the shiny side of the mirror at the reflection of the normal hand, it looks like the phantom has come back. And then you ask him to start moving his normal hand. He gets the vivid visual illusion that the phantom is also moving. And in some cases, this seems to relieve the painful cramping sensation in the phantom arm. Now, this needs to be evaluated using double-blind clinical trials. That hasn't been done yet. But we have had success with many patients who take the mirror home, practice with it, and say now they can move their phantom hand. Somehow the mirror mobilizes the phantom, and this alleviates the pain.
The strange and complex functionality of the brain becomes a greater challenge for the scientific mind when entering the dark field of mental illness, an area where normal brain functions, as we know them, stop working. These images show the pathological changes of a brain suffering from Alzheimer's disease, one of the illnesses of our time related to memory and aging. The size and capacities of the brain have decreased due to the illness. As with almost all mental illnesses, the most serious effects are expressed in alterations of consciousness. Patients with Alzheimer's slowly lose their memory, as well as their personality, their identity, and their perceptions as individuals. Submerged in a mental black hole, the patient does not even realize that he is participating in life. Life is nothing more than a vegetative state. Insanity, the abstract term that describes profound mental illnesses, marks a frontier beyond which the consciousness of an individual dissolves. Brain dysfunction is such that the brain is not even able to organize the reception of information. Millions of facts and stimuli accumulate upon entering the brain, which registers them and mixes them up chaotically. As a result, the individual loses himself and loses his basic reference points, without being able to distinguish his internal sensations and his own voices from external signals. Neurological research aspires to understand and dominate the brain, like any other human organ. And only with this knowledge will the great dream of consciousness become possible, the control of our minds. Will man ever reach a new cerebral stage?
It's amazing, we know much more about color vision. We've studied it for 100 years. We know all the laws of color vision. We know what parts of the eye are involved, what the cells are doing, what the pigments are doing, what parts of the brain are involved, V4 in the fusiform gyrus, the thin stripes, the blobs in area 18. We know all of that. But if you ask about what is love, what is jealousy, what is ambition, we have no idea, other than what anybody on the street can tell you. But all of this is happening in here, in your brain. And that's certainly going to involve a knowledge of neurochemistry, because we know that chemicals can profoundly influence mood and emotion.
According to scientific research, everything that takes place in the brain is in essence physical and chemical. Therefore, if the mysteries of the cerebral laboratory were revealed, man would be able to control his state of mind as he desires, thanks to medication. Today, this hypothetical chemical well-being is already being experienced through the use of certain medications, like the latest antidepressants, which have become a sociological phenomenon. For psychiatrists and psychologists, however, the reason behind human unhappiness is not always biological, genetic, or derived from a cerebral chemical. The past, the environment, or the type of personality can be the origin of a chronic depression, for which medication is used to alleviate the symptoms and not as a solution to the problem. On the other hand, if pleasure could be provoked in a continuous and stable manner, and if pain could be eliminated, where would we place the frontier between desirable well-being and an insensitive state of mind? To respond to this question, and so many others related to the mechanisms of the mind, brain scientists at this time can only offer partial answers according to their field, whether biological, chemical, or psychological. The brain is the greatest challenge that science faces, since we know very little about the governing organ of human beings. In other words, the organ that governs us.
Neuroscience is certainly in lack of new unifying theories. I think we all sense this. We have a disproportionate amount of data relative to the theories we have. So it's not like in physics where theory advances and then produces a flood of data, but then is unified again. Neuroscience is the science that has grown the fastest over the last decades, recruits more and more people, and enters more and more neighboring domains. It touches onto philosophy. It touches, of course, onto the social sciences, because it's the brain that produces the behavior which the social scientists analyze. So it is the science of the natural sciences that has most contacts to the humanities. And this will also make it grow, because there will be interdisciplinary adventures on the borders.